Thank you for joining for this episode of the TechSpective podcast. My guest is Itzik from Entro. So, if you want to, give a little bit of an introduction of yourself and of Entro, and kind of talk about what you do.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Tony. I'm Itzik Alvas. I'm the CEO of Entro Security. Entro is a non-human identity lifecycle management and secret security platform. I started my cyber security journey about 20 years ago in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. I was on the offensive side of cyber over there, but then moving to the public market. Was mainly doing cyber security in management positions. So prior to Entro Security, I was in charge for the internal security of one of Microsoft's clouds. Prior to that, I was a CISO, Chief Information Security Officer of the biggest healthcare organization in Israel. And non-human identities and secrets was a big headache for me during my past years. So decided with a friend of mine to tackle that problem.
Okay. Well, so let's start there. I think it's a good place to start the conversation, which is essentially, when you and I spoke previously, we talked about this some, that I know a lot of company founders in the United States and in Israel who are former intelligence, former military, and bring that perspective to the private sector and to solving problems. So as you taking your military background and then your background working in the industry, what was it that what was the spark where you said, hey, you know what, we need a company that focuses on non-human identity? Like how did you decide to start Entro?
Right. So at the IDF, you're working in a nation state, and it's there's a lot to do, and the scale is massive, and also the expectation of solving problem is quite unique. So they spend a lot of time to teach you how to properly solve problems, and it's a bit, or maybe very different from the public sector. But the spark was actually outside of the military. So when I was a CISO, we were breached by non-human identities. That was the first time that I was breached, and it was a huge event for us. And then when I was at Microsoft, we were breached twice by non-human identities. Since I left, there was, I think, 3 more times they were breached by non-human identities. But when I was there, they were breached twice, and that was my 3rd time being breached by non-human identities. And it always was a big gap for me, but now attackers are starting to leverage that. So I started to think about different solutions. And a friend of mine, Adam Shriki, is now the CTO of Entro Security, the co-founder and CTO, and he was working at Broadcom. And Broadcom had an event. So I reached out and I was like, hey, Adam, what are you guys doing over there? How do you secure your secrets? How do you secure your non-human identities? And with no solution out there, we started to think what we should do, how should we do it, and one thing led to another, and basically we started Entro. I'm summarizing everything because it was a longer journey than what I'm currently describing. But yeah, that's basically what led the spark. Having experienced a few breaches in my past.
Okay, so I like to think that my audience and my podcast audience is relatively tech savvy and knows a thing or two about cybersecurity, which is probably true. But just to level set, can you just talk a little bit about what is a non-human identity? What is non-human identity management?
Sure. So non-human identities are essentially programmatic access keys that applications are using in order to access and authenticate against services or resources they need. So if an application needs to use a database, they need some sort of credential to access and authenticate against the database. And that credential is actually a secret or a non-human identity, and they come in a lot of different types and forms. So service accounts, API keys, connection strings, cloud access tokens, and so forth are all different types of non-human identities. And again, those are essentially programmatic access keys that applications are using to access and authenticate resources they need against resources they need.
Okay. So, I've addressed this in the past on the podcast, but I think the area that you're dealing in, the area of non-human identity, is I think a lot of people don't realize it's the vast majority of identity. That we talk a lot about identity and access management in terms of my credentials or your credentials and usernames and passwords and two-factor authentication and multi-factor authentication, and all of those things are important. But for most organizations, if you're talking about a mid-size, an enterprise or whatever, the volume of non-human identity, that ratio is astronomical. I mean, I would be making up a number, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's 100 to 1, 1,000 to 1.
You are definitely correct. So it's not okay. So Gartner, which is probably the leading research and analyst firm in the world, they're saying for every one human employee you have within the organization, you will have at least 45 non-human identities. At our customer base, the benchmark we're seeing is 92, which is pretty close to the 100 you said.
Okay.
So we're seeing an average of one human employee will result in 92 non-human identities. And yeah, so it's a vast problem. It's every organization have a lot of different non-human identities, but the challenge with them is usually those non-human identities have a lot more permissions than human identities. So human identities, human users can access Office, Outlook, maybe Slack, and so forth, the Drive. So of course you have some, sensitive data that human employees can access, but then non-human identities can access databases that have much more sensitive data, right? They can access storage account with much more sensitive data, credit cards, SSNs, and so forth. And usually because developers are the ones who are creating, using, and permissioning those non-human identities, they usually give them more permissions than they even need. So you have a lot of non-human identities out there, 92 per one, with excessive privileges and no way to manage or secure them. Also, there's so many applications and solutions out there to secure human identities, like multi-factor authentication, right? That's been around for a long time. You're trying to log in, you're getting one-time access code, you're using it with the addition of your password, and that's pretty secure. Non-human identities, they have no MFA. Usually those are static credentials with excessive privileges and a lot more non-human identities than humans. So yeah, it's a huge issue for sure.
Well, and from what you've seen, from what you know, is the trend that's actually growing and getting worse? Because I imagine with we already rely on machine learning and AI, but with generative AI, like the more we're doing, the more we're automating, and the more we're connecting systems to AI, the more we're relying on non-human identity to get all these things done.
Yes, you are definitely correct. With AI, the more we automate, the more non-human identities we have. That's a great thing. So like back then, everybody had a monolith. Even now, every organization have a monolith. And that monolith, that monolith application should usually connect into databases, storage accounts, whatever resource they need. And they have a set of non-human identities to help them facilitate that authentication. But now when people are breaking up that monolith into microservices, each microservice needs its own set of keys, and that's more non-human identities. Every new cloud solution or any new solution or resource you guys are using, that's another non-human identity to facilitate that authentication. And one of them, and a big one of them, is AI for sure. So AI requires a lot of automation, can help us do a lot of things, but also definitely increase the number of non-human identities we have, and sometimes can even operate them and use them to access data we don't want him to access, for sure.
Okay. Okay. So we've established that this is a big challenge for organizations, that they whether they know it or not, it's a big challenge to manage and protect these things. So let's switch gears and talk about how does Entro help with kind of the sprawl of secrets and non-human identities? Like what is Entro doing to help me manage this?
Right. I think maybe two more sentences about the problem. For the human users, we have softwares that are helping us to centralize the management of them, like Active Directory, like Okta, and so forth. For non-human identities, we don't really have those. And going back to what we discussed earlier, because developers, DevOps, SREs are the one who are creating them, using them, permissioning them, they also scattering them around. So they can store them within storage solutions, vaults like HashiCorp Vault or AWS Secrets Manager, but usually they are storing them within at least 5 different vaults solutions. And then they are also committing them into code, sending them over Slack or Teams, within Confluence pages, and so forth. So I think the number one challenge we're seeing in the industry is that security teams don't really know how many non-human identities they have and where are they. And then usually those non-human identities are also long randomized strings. So even if they find one, they don't really have any context on it. They don't know who's the human owner, who created it, which application is using it, to access what the permissions, and so forth. And when you combine everything we talked about, you have so many non-human identities, no MFA, no centralized, you don't know how many you have, where, or what they're able to do. That's why organizations are really struggling to protect them. And today, and for the past 4 years in a row, by the way, non-human identities are the second most frequent attack vector out there and the number one most costly attack to an organization. And I think that should summarize the problem area around non-human identities.
Okay.
Yeah, so to answer your question, at least what Entro is doing with that, we believe non-human identities should be managed and secure, or to automate the lifecycle of non-human identities and start managing it. And Entro is doing that by 6 different pillars. So we allow organizations to securely use non-human identities by letting them automate and secure the lifecycle of them. And the very first pillar is inventory. So getting a list of all of your non-human identities, understand how many you have and where, and Entro is able to discover them at their creation location, storage locations, or exposure locations. So if someone created a new token at your AWS, Entro will detect that and show it. If someone stored a new secret at your vault, we're gonna find that as well. And also if someone exposed the token, like sent it over Slack, or committed it into code, we're gonna also find that and provide an excessive inventory, full inventory that will allow organization to understand how many non-human identities they have and where. And then we will classify and enrich each one of those non-human identities. So that's the second pillar, classification and the business context, basically visualizing a map of each and every one of those non-human identities. that's stating which application are using what kind of non-human identity to access what resource, and other vital data around it, like tracking its activities, understanding who's the human owner, permissions, rotation time, and so forth. Basically, the blast radius of each and every one of them. So that's in terms of visibility. And then we're taking that inventory and classification and doing static risk analysis. So understanding the risks of them, the misconfiguration of those non-human identities, to answer questions like how many of my secrets are not securely stored within vaults, how many of them have excessive privileges they don't need, and so forth. So any misconfiguration or static risk. Also, we then do dynamic risk analysis, non-human identity detection and response, and that's an abnormal behavior around non-human identities. So if someone from China or Russia is using our token and we're not doing business with those countries, that's an abnormal behavior that we should prevent. If someone is downloading tokens from our environment, that's another thing we should prevent. So any abnormal behavior, and then we're gonna move into the remediation side. So basically automated remediation, like rotating, replacing secrets automatically, move them automatically to Vault, and also removal of any idle, stale token that is no longer in use. At our customer base, we're seeing that about 40% of all tokens are actually idle or stale. And that means that you can go ahead and remove them and decrease your attack surface by 40% like that. So those are the different pillars that Entro platform supports.
Okay. What is like I don't really know off the top of my head like how it's architected or implemented like within the network. Like as an end user, would I see anything or is there any sort of impact on my endpoint in terms of operation, or is it just something that the IT team sees?
Yeah, so it's usually been managed by the security side. Entro is completely out of band, so no interference with anybody whatsoever, not with the development teams, not with IT teams. Usually security are the ones who are the owners of a platform like Entro. And our main goal is to reclaim control over non-human identities and secrets to security teams. So yeah, security teams are the one who are managing it. And again, we're completely out of band. We're using APIs, reading logs, and so forth in order to achieve the lifecycle management and security that I described earlier.
Okay. What's the normal? It's like how does Entro like connect to or integrate with other tools or systems within the environment? Like, what's the normal workflow?
Right. So Entro supports APIs and webhooks, so we can be integrated into a lot of different tools easily. We support the stack that of our customers. So yeah, the onboarding is pretty straightforward. Like if you need to onboard, usually for at least cloud systems, we also support on-prem systems. But for cloud systems, the onboarding is like 15 minutes. For on-prem, it can take like an hour or so. And usually everything is being connected via APIs. We also support a lot of integrations out of the box. And that means like a couple of clicks and you're integrated. But even if we don't, you can integrate us via our webhooks and APIs.
Okay. All right. So, we had, we talked about, the 92-to-1 ratio today and
Yeah.
kind of the advent of AI and our kind of increasing trend toward automation. I'm curious, like, what are your thoughts on kind of where things are, like where things are going? So like, what's the kind of the role or the scope of non-human identity in 5 years?
Yeah, I think it will definitely increase. So identity is the new perimeter. Maybe that's a sentence you heard before. but it's true. So when we worked within data centers before the cloud, and we had our own firewalls and network boundaries and so forth, and we can do whatever we wanted with our non-human identities. It was still a risk, but less severe because we had network boundary. Nowadays, where everything in the cloud, like we're using Datadog in the cloud that have a lot of personal data over there. We're using MongoDB in the cloud, AWS, Azure. All of our data and every system we are using is in the cloud. And that means that if we will lose the identity that grants permissions over those systems, anybody can use it in order to authenticate and see everything we got. So definitely identity will continue to be the new perimeter for organizations, and the number of non-human identities will continue to explode for a good reason, by the way. And organizations, they just need to be aware of it and find the needed practices to secure the new perimeter.
Okay. Pretty much every conversation I've had in the last 2 years has somehow come back to generative AI, and and like I said, it's a little bit almost silly in cybersecurity, just because everything was already built on AI and ML, and generative AI is just kind of like a minor tweak on it. But it has it is for anyone, but definitely in cybersecurity, it seems to be somewhat table stakes. It's just expected that you're doing these things now. So I wanted to ask, in what ways are in what ways is Entro using AI or automation, like within the platform or just internal within the organization?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways companies are using AI. Entro is using AI for different features. Some of them relating to permissions, to understand what are permissions that the non-human identity is not leveraging and not using, and those are qualified as excessive privileges that needs to be removed or right-sized. Another aspect of it is the abnormal behavior, like what is normal, right? Tracking and understanding how our applications are actually using those non-human identities, and then what is abnormal, and if so, is it a risk? If something is abnormal, it doesn't really means directly it's a risk, right? So understanding what is risk, AI can help a lot with that. Another thing that AI can be great at is basically asking questions. So we have, a very sophisticated system, and we have a great UI, very comfortable to navigate. But still, if you want to ask some questions like, hey, what's my top 5 most critical non-human identities? You can just drop it into chat, and the AI will help you figure it out. So those are some use cases. We have some more, but those are some examples of how Entro is leveraging AI.
Okay. Non-human identities are not the only thing out there, and you are also the CEO of a company. So what, in terms of what you see in the broader threat landscape or whatever, like what concerns you?
Personally, what concerns me, at least in the cybersecurity realm, is definitely machines and how they interact. So some aspect of it is the identity of those machines, the non-human identities. Another aspect is what they can access, how they are accessing it, and yes, AI is a big portion of it. But like the same as I spoke about earlier, about breaking up the monoliths and creating more microservices and more automations that you said earlier. There's a lot more machines, and they are able to do a lot more stuff. And some controls are needed. Some of them are within the non-human identity realm, but others are around, vulnerabilities and so forth. and the sheer scale of those machines, it's just so difficult to keep everything under control.
Well, and it also seems to me I'm going to use the word scale again, but the scale of what. So, like, if I, as a human being, somehow breach your identity, I steal your identity and I log in as you, whatever, I managed to get into the system. That's obviously that is a breach, that is a compromise, that is a problem.
Yeah.
But I'm working at human speed.
Right.
If a non-human identity that has these kind of like elevated privileges has access to sensitive information, it's able to extract and parse and correlate that information way faster than I can. So
sure.
I might stumble across a sensitive email that you sent, but a non-human identity will just pull your whole email database.
Right. Speed of the code. That's correct. That's the speed of the code. Yeah, if you will lose one non-human identity with permissions, that's usually game over. They will use it in order to create more non-human identities like that, create more backdoors. We've seen it. We've seen it with LastPass. We've seen it with Dropbox lately. Staples, a lot. So yeah,
Right.
if you lose one, that's probably game over. I agree.
Yeah, I mean, and in those situations, I mean, if you have the right things in place and you have a decent IT security team, you should be able to forensically look at once you figure out, okay, well, we were breached, we found this thing, you should be able to forensically kind of look and go, okay, well, show me the identities that have been created in the last month or whatever, since this initial breach, so that you can try to parse that together and find out, like, okay, well, are these legitimate or were these created by the threat actors? But not everyone has those capabilities per se, and in some environments it's just so complex and such a mess that I think that would be hard to do. You have so many identities coming and going that kind of sifting through them to try to figure out, okay, out of these 10,000 identities, which ones are illegitimate.
Right. So going back to the no centralized place to rule them all, it's a huge challenge to achieve what you just said without a proper non-human identity management platform like Entro is supplying. Trying to understand when a non-human identity got created, what are the permissions, and so forth. That's a huge challenge. Also, remember there's a lot of ephemeral non-human identities. They are doing some task and that's it. They are gone. And you can see it with the different functions out there like Lambda and Azure function and so forth. So there's a lot of ephemeral non-human identities. So keeping tabs on everyone manually, that's close to impossible. So yeah, that's also a huge gap. Trying to backtrack and understand when a non-human identity got created and if it was breached and who used it. Manually, it's a big challenge. Also, a friend of ours is an analyst. I think I told you that before. So he exposed a token on a public-facing GitHub, and he wanted to understand like how long will it take an attacker to start using that one, and it took him 3 minutes. So after 3 minutes of an exposure, if we will take that data point, after 3 minutes, someone will start using that non-human identity and leverage it. Within 5 hours, it was hundreds of different connections. And that means that you, as an organization, needs to find a breach and remediate it within 3 minutes. So even if you are able to do the manual work that you outlined earlier,
Right.
If you're not doing that within minutes, it's probably a lost cause.
Okay. So this becomes almost a self-fulfilling question. So obviously the answer is contact Entro, but but what advice do you have for organizations to get a handle on secrets management and non-human identities?
Right. So even if you're not going and purchasing or at least evaluating a non-human identity management platform or secret security platform, which I definitely recommend. Like that was my problem, and that's why I created Entro. At least have a policy in place. At least start to track it. Try to do it manually. Publish that policy around the organization. We have a great one, a great template for non-human identity policy, and also a checklist of critical capabilities for non-human identities. So go into Entro website, go under resources, and download that policy. We have one per organization size, and start implementing it. Maybe change it, fit it to what you think is needed, but at least have a policy in place and at least start, walking in the right direction. Of course, I recommend understand how many non-human identities you have and where, even without, abnormal behaviors and static analysis, risk analysis and so forth. At least understand, at least have an inventory, like a centralized place. You can go and understand how many tokens can access my AWS environment with admin permission and so forth. At least have that. But even if you don't, create a policy and you can download a great template from our website.
Okay. Well, I was going to say, again, I feel like, the default answer is, well, of course, contact Entro, or at least take a look at Entro. But
yeah.
I think that if I'm a CISO of an enterprise and I started to do what you just recommended, I would probably very quickly come back to, well, I just need to contact Entro. Or somebody, because it's like as soon as you start trying to do that, where you're like, all right, well, let me just create an Excel spreadsheet, and I'll just start filling this in, and by the time you get to line 5,000, you say, you know what, this is not tenable. I'm not going to be able to do this manually.
Right. Yeah, it's difficult to do manually, for sure. We also offer free assessments, and self-serve assessments. So again, at our website, people can onboard and at least get some reports of all of their non-human identities, where they are, permissions, static risk, how many of them are idle, how many of them are within vault. So they can also do some free assessments. But again, without going into projects or doing free assessments, at least have some guidelines and policy and send them to the development team, and create some awareness on that problem, because again, that's the second most frequent attack vector out there.
Okay. All right. Well, I mean, we can kind of wind down, but I wanted to, I guess, kind of, well, two things to wind down. Number one would just be opening the floor to you to talk about if there was something that you want to talk about that I didn't ask about. Like, feel free to have some closing thoughts. But then the other one was, I was just going to ask if you have anything that you are reading or listening to, books, podcasts that you would recommend. So yeah, those.
Yeah, I love, regarding podcast, I love CISO series. I was CISO myself, and I love that one. Other than that, I'm hearing a lot of entrepreneurs podcasts, how to build the right companies, how to treat my team and so forth, how to scale a business. So I'm spending a lot of time with doing cybersecurity, listening to cybersecurity podcasts, and then entrepreneurs podcasts.
Okay.
So maybe the fourth one is the CISO series is a better recommendation for this audience. I love a lot of sci-fi, so the books are usually sci-fi when I have the time. Regarding closing thoughts, then yes, just think we covered non-human identities, but try to learn more. Like other than listening to this amazing podcast, try to learn more, read some more, Google it, go into our website. We have a lot of great materials around non-human identities, not only the policies, but the different types of them, the usage of them, the different risks, how to resolve them, and so forth. There's a lot more knowledge to read and dig into at our website and in Google. So just be familiar with the risks and with the problems. And I'm sure that once you are familiar with everything, you will find the most suitable solution for you.
Awesome. All right. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to join me. It was a good, interesting conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. Tony, thanks for having me.
I appreciate you investing your time to listen to the podcast, but I also invite you to engage on social media. Please go like our Facebook page and follow at TechSpective on Twitter and Instagram. You can feel free to let me know what you like, let me know what you don't like, let me know if you love it, let me know if it sucks, and let me know what products you'd like to see reviewed or what questions you'd like to see answered in future posts.